lesson this week, Paul reveals one of the secrets of living a life full of joy. In chapter 4, verse 11, he says, I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. Now, the best teaching that I've ever heard on contentment comes from a sermon by Jeremiah Burrows that was preached in the 1600s. I got the sermon out of a book of the best sermons ever preached under the title of The Rare Jewel of Christian Contentment. And he preached it in the 1600s in Cripplegate Church in London. Now, a lot of what I want to share this week comes from this very excellent sermon. It's helped me so much in my own struggles with discontentment. But before I share with you some of the excerpts from the sermon, I want to give you a little background into Jeremiah's life. Jeremiah was married to Sarah and they had 7 children. They lost one of those children to the plague, and there were so many other reasons for them to be discontent. At that time in the 1600s, the Puritans were being persecuted by the Anglicans. And in fact, for a 6-year period, Jeremiah and Sarah were exiled to Holland. And it was there that Jeremiah served as the pastor to a church in Rotterdam. But they were allowed to return after that. Nevertheless, their life was still full of persecution and struggle. And that's why a lot of the Puritans actually went to North America. They left England at that time. But Jeremiah and Sarah stayed. Now, I tell you this because I think knowing a little bit about their history, their story, will make his sermon even more meaningful. He begins by defining contentment. He says that Christian contentment is a sweet, inward, quiet, gracious frame of mind. It is inward like joy. He says some people refrain from murmuring, and yet inwardly they are bursting with discontent. But for those who have learned contentment, we tell our friends our sad condition, and that's good. We shouldn't be in denial. We should talk about it. We should work through it. And then we ask them to speak a word to God on our behalf. We do not fret or vex. There is no tumultuousness of spirit such that thoughts run distractingly and work in a confused manner. I love the way he words these things. Our heart is not so distracted that we wince from present duties, nor are we tempted to sinful shiftings and shirkings to get relief. There is no rising of rebellion against God, but instead a quietness of spirit under the affliction. It's a great definition, this contentment, this inner peace. Now he goes on in the sermon to counsel us about what to think about when we feel that sense of discontent rising up. First, when consumed with discontent and want, consider the greatness of the mercies that we have. When we are tempted to consider what we lack, that's the very time to look at what God has given us and to be grateful. Burrows quotes Martin Luther in his sermon. Martin Luther has said, "The sea of God's mercies shall swallow up all our afflictions." If you pour a pail full of water on the floor in your house, it makes a great show. But if you pour the water into the ocean, there is no sign of it. So afflictions considered in themselves we think are great, but if we consider them within the sea of God's mercies that we enjoy, then they are not so much. They are nothing in comparison. And Burrows tells the story of a good man who lived 50 years, and he enjoyed health for 48 of those years. But the last 2 years were spent in disease and pain. But he reasoned with himself. He said, "O Lord, you might have made all of my life a time of torment and pain, but you have let me have 48 years of health, and so I will praise you for the mercies I have had, and I will be content." He goes on to say, consider that we have but little time walking this earth. To keep it all in perspective, he says, if you're a Christian, you will never suffer nor do without except in this world. Why, do but shut your eyes, and soon after another life is here. As one martyr said to his fellow martyr, do but shut your eyes, and you shall wake up in a far better place. 3. Do not pour so much upon your afflictions. Busy your thoughts so much that you have no time to look down upon your afflictions that bring you discontent. So if you find yourself taken up with crosses and burdens, stop thinking and speaking about them. In other words, don't obsess about them. He said, stop being like a child who has a sore and their finger is always on the sore. When you're awake at night, your thoughts are on your afflictions. When you converse with others, your thoughts are on your afflictions. When you're praying and thinking about your afflictions. No wonder you lead a discontented life. Instead, put your thoughts on the things that comfort you. Number 4, he said, when times are hard and you're tempted to be discontent, make a good interpretation of God's ways toward you. He says some people are always making a bad interpretation of what occurs in their life. And he says, don't you think God finds that rather irritating and tedious when we're always quick to make a bad interpretation? So when affliction comes, many good senses can be made of God's ways toward us. We might think it may be that through this, God intends to try me and to build my strength. It may be that God saw my heart was too much on creature comforts and he intends to show me what is in my heart and to protect me. It may be that God saw that if my wealth continued, I would fall into sin. The better my position, the worse my soul. And again, God was looking out for me. It may be that God intends to exercise some grace in his time to show himself mighty. Or it may be that God intends to prepare me for some future work that he has for me. We must not say, surely God means to manifest his wrath against me. That's the worst interpretation that we can make. Why not make a better one? God will be overjoyed when we do, and we will not struggle so much with discontent. And finally, contentment draws comfort from those things we do not possess. I don't imagine in the 1600s they had the struggle with materialism that we have today, but obviously from what he says, they still struggled with it. He says often those who don't have outward things have more comfort than those who do. Contentment alone can make our lives sweet and comfortable. Just the grace of contentment. And we see in our letter to the Philippians that Paul experienced that very thing. If we require things to make us content, then we are dependent upon those things. We need to realize that contentment is a little bit like heaven on earth. That heaven is rest and quiet of our spirits, and it's joy, it's satisfaction in God. That's what makes heaven so wonderful. Well, we can be in a contented state right now where there is rest and joy and satisfaction in God. A contented heart is always praising God, and when we do that, we can have a little bit of heaven in our contented spirit right now. Burrows uses this illustration from Plutarch in his sermon. He says, a servant stood before his mighty warrior king to see if he could persuade the king to desist from wars. The servant said humbly, may it please your majesty, it is reported that our enemies, the Romans, are very good at war, and if it pleases the gods that we overcome them, what benefit shall we have in that victory? The king answered, we shall then straightway conquer all the rest of Italy with ease. Indeed, that is likely, answered the servant. But when we have won Italy, will our wars be over then? No, said the king. Then the way would be made for us to go into Africa and then on to Carthage. But when we have everything in our hands, what shall we do then? Asked the servant. The king laughed and he said, well, then we'll be quiet and take our ease and have feasts every day and be as merry with one another as we can possibly be. The servant said softly to the king, yes, but what prevents us now from being quiet and merry together? We can enjoy immediately all of those things without further travel, trouble, danger, even the shedding of blood. Could we not sit down and be merry now? And so we may think, if I had such a thing, then I would have another. And if I had that, then I would have still another. But what if you get everything you desire? Then would you be content? I tell you truly, you may be content now without those things. Contentment does not come from what we possess, but it comes from joy, satisfaction in God, loving others well, and living out the purposes that God has for us in this life. Burrows ends his sermon by saying there's no better way to worship God than to show his glory by being contented. He says there is beauty in God's creation, the woods, the mountains, the oceans, the skies. Even earthly people will marvel at those things and say they see the glory of God. But there is no work which God has made which shows his glory as much as the person who lives quietly in the midst of a fallen world. That is our worship, to show the glory of God. Paul's showing us that it's possible never to be in want of anything. If someone asks you, I could show you a way to do this, wouldn't you be interested? Well, Paul is telling us that when he says we can learn contentment. We'll be able to say with Paul, I have learned in whatsoever state I am, whether it's in the midst of storms or tempest, whatever state I'm in, therewith to be content.